It is wonderful to be with you. This is a survey course that I do in my New Testament class, and I cover different emphases for different books. So for Matthew, I deal more with Jesus' teachings, especially eschatological teachings, talking about the kingdom. In Mark, I talk more about the cross and about suffering. In Luke, I talk more about caring for the poor and so on. Um, a lot of these emphases overlap among the Gospels, but because it's a survey course, I have to abbreviate and just sample what's in the Gospels. Luke has a heavy emphasis on the outpouring of the Spirit, but I'm reserving that for the book of Acts so that I can give you as many samples as possible. Now, I know that different professors would probably emphasize different features of the books, so these are just samples, but I want to give you an introduction and then the samples. Now I'm sharing my screen so that you don't have to look at me the whole time. Um, and I do need to warn you, though, that this is an abbreviated form of what I teach in my New Testament course. So if what I normally share in Luke is just samples, these are samples of samples. And here we are going to talk about Luke as the first Christian historian. History was written a bit differently back then than it is today, but it's, modern historiography has descended from ancient historiography, so they have a whole lot in common. Luke 1:1-4, Luke's preface, tells us much about the sources that he would have had available to him. He talks about in verse 1, many have already written accounts of these things, so there were many written sources already available. Verse 2, he talks about consulting eyewitnesses, talks about oral sources that were passed on. In verse 3, Luke assures us that he had thorough acquaintance with the events that are reported. And in Luke chapter 1 and verse 4, Luke tells us that he couldn't just make things up. Since the material was already widely known in the early church, Luke says, Theophilus, I'm writing this to confirm the things that you've already heard. So we know this information was already widely circulated in the early church. Now, there are differences of date, but the majority of scholars date Luke between 60 and 90. Some scholars date some scholars date Acts at least in the 90s, and the second volume, the book of Acts, after 100. But most scholars date somewhere between 60 and 90. I take a median approach. I say around the year 75, but some of this is guesswork. But because I believe it's a companion of Paul, I don't want to date it too late, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the book of Acts. But by the time Luke writes, he says many people have already written about Jesus. Now, most scholars date Mark and also some material that they believe that is shared by Matthew and Luke before Luke's gospel. So the vast majority of scholars, wherever they are, conservative or liberal, date Mark within about 40 years of the events, and Q often a bit earlier than that. And when I say within about 40 years, give or take 5 or 6 years, a number of scholars date Mark like around 64 or so, but that's to be talked about when we discuss Mark. Now, are the events of 40 years before us shrouded in amnesia? I mean, do you know anybody who was around 40 years ago? I certainly was around 40 years ago. Here are a couple pictures of me back when I had hair, when I was an undergraduate. But I mean, there are people around who remember things that were going on 40 years ago. So you can't just say, 40 years, that's too long. Nobody would remember anything. We have a number of oral sources. Luke says, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Now, this is the technical language when it's used in the context of oral tradition for careful oral traditioning. How accurate could that be? Well, ancient Mediterranean memory, and this has been true in many cultures until more recently, I mean, now as we depend more on Google and so on, we don't emphasize individual memory as much. But in many cultures, this was part of education all along. In the Middle East, until recently, in many cultures. And even in the United States, this was a common form of learning in the early 20th century. I've interviewed people who were around back then. But ancient Mediterranean memory, storytellers who could repeat all of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey by heart. They could recount stories that went on for hours in length, tweaking it a bit here and there for their audiences, but having the basic storyline just right. Orators who again would memorize their speeches in preparation for delivery, speeches that often could go on for a couple hours. Elementary education, the most basic feature of ancient Mediterranean elementary education was memorization. Disciples of teachers, that was considered advanced education. And the main responsibility of disciples was to be able to pass on the teachings of their school. You take the most extreme example, just for the purpose of, we tend to remember things that are more graphic. Pythagoreans were said not to be able to get out of bed in the morning until they could repeat back everything that they'd heard from their teacher the day before. And they would learn deeds as well as sayings. There's a story told about a rabbi who was getting ready to make love to his wife and found a disciple under his bed. And he said, "What are you doing under my bed?" To which the disciple is said to have replied, "We must learn everything from the example of our teacher. If I find anyone under my bed, you will flunk, I assure you." But in any case, people wanted to learn the deeds of their teachers as well as the sayings, because they thought their examples were also useful. Well, most of the church's most prominent leaders that we read about in undisputed letters of Paul were not just eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry, but they were his disciples. They were people who learned the way a student would learn from a teacher. And some people say, well, maybe they couldn't read. There were different kinds of schools in antiquity. Some learned by reading, but a lot of them learned orally. And so the expectation would still be the same, of learning the person's teachings and passing them on carefully. What should we expect of Jesus' disciples? Why should we expect Jesus' disciples to prove less reliable than other disciples of teachers? Virtually all scholars agree that Jesus was a teacher with disciples. So they would have presumably preserved the substance of his teaching. And some of the written sources may have been circulating while these eyewitnesses were still in leadership in the Jerusalem church. By the way, teachers back then, and this has been going on for half a millennium, teachers back then often left publication to their disciples. And if the disciples couldn't write well, the disciples could dictate. That's how most people composed back then. They dictated. If they were rich and well educated, they dictated because they could. If they were poor and they couldn't afford much education and they weren't able to write well themselves, they dictated and somebody else wrote it down. Verse 3, Luke tells us that he had thorough knowledge. What does that mean? Some translations say he carefully investigated everything from the beginning. Well, that was the Hellenistic historical ideal. You should investigate, but best of all was participatory acquaintance with the material. At least go check out the site, interview the eyewitnesses, and so on. Luke may even be claiming more than just interviewing eyewitnesses here. When could Luke have participated in any of the events? Well, he probably didn't for the gospel, probably wasn't there for the events of the gospel. But in the book of Acts, we read about we. Now, some scholars claim that we is a fictitious literary device to give Luke authority, but that literary device doesn't appear in historical works anywhere else that we know of in antiquity. So they're making that up just to say Luke wasn't there, even though there's no historical reason to make that argument. Some claim it's left over from a travel journal. Well, that's possible. But since Luke edits his sources, I mean, he says he interviewed people in chapter 1 and verse 2 of Luke's gospel, but he doesn't keep a we or I anywhere else. Unless Luke was an inept editor, why would he have kept the we only in one source? Chances are, yeah, it probably was a travel journal, probably was Luke's own. Normally in antiquity, we means we, myself plus somebody else. So Luke, chances are, did travel with Paul a good bit in the last quarter of the book of Acts and a little bit before that. And we see it comes and goes in the book of Acts, but especially predominates toward the later part. And it includes roughly 2 years spent with Paul in Judea. Well, he would have had plenty of time to talk with witnesses. And again in verse 4, Luke simply confirms what was already widely known, information to which Theophilus had great access. Now, Luke wouldn't dare just make up things that contradicted what his audience already knew. It's like Paul citing his audience's knowledge of miracles in 2 Corinthians 12:12. It would be like me saying, I recognize you all. You were in my class last week when I gave my lecture on astrophysics or paleobotany. And you would say, I don't remember that. Well, I wouldn't be able to persuade you of that because it's not true. I can't appeal to your eyewitness knowledge of something that you have eyewitness knowledge is false. And so Luke is not making these things up. At least the substance of what he says, when he says, Theophilus, I'm confirming what you already know, Theophilus had to have already heard many of these stories. Now, when ancient historians wrote, they often would parallel different characters. And Luke shows us his interest in this method. And it appears in the Old Testament too, but thinking in terms of Greek historiography, people would recognize this method. Luke shows us his interest in this right from the start. He finishes his historical preface, Luke 1:1-4, and then the rest of Luke 1 is especially about Zechariah, Mary, Elizabeth, and Gabriel. And so we see the comparison of characters. It starts with a vision of Gabriel coming to Zechariah, and the vision's recipient is troubled. Well, we learn the same thing when Gabriel comes to Mary. Now, if you just leave it there, that's probably not too surprising. I mean, most of us would be surprised if an angel appears to us. In both cases, the angel says, don't fear, which again, well, angels usually say something like that when they appear to somebody. Then the reason for the miracle is stated, and then the child's name is given, in one case John, in the other case Jesus. In both cases, it said this child will be great. In John's case, it says he'll be filled with the Holy Spirit from his mother's womb. In Jesus' case, he'll be conceived through the Holy Spirit. Both cases, Gabriel goes on to list the mission. Then you have a question or an objection from Zechariah or Mary. And then you have the angel giving a proof or explanation. But Zechariah ends up muted for his unbelief, and Mary ends up praised for her faith. So we see some comparisons between the two good characters, but Mary turns out to be greater than Zechariah. This runs contrary to ancient expectations. The aged male priest serving in the temple should be way more devout and fearing and trusting God than this probably teenage girl in Nazareth that probably before Jesus nobody had ever heard of outside of Galilee. And yet Mary is the one who exercises greater faith. And her child also is going to be greater, and John, compared with John the Baptist, and that will continue in the narrative as both children grow. But John is a prophet in the wilderness, and Jesus, of course, is more than that. He's God's son. So Luke also continues the Old Testament narrative. He's not starting from scratch. He's assuming that you already know the backstory of the Old Testament. So when Mary is praising God, her song is similar to Hannah's song. Now, Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 2 didn't give birth to the Messiah. She didn't have a virgin birth, but she did have a miraculous birth. And so her praise to God forms a background for Mary's praise to God. Both talk about God exalting the lowly, rejoicing in God's salvation, the Lord being holy, the proud being brought down, the humble being exalted, and so forth. And an ancient audience steeped in the Hebrew Bible, well, in this case, in Luke's case, steeped in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, would be ready for this. They'd be familiar for this. Luke also emphasizes very heavily God's care for the marginalized. So we think about that in Luke chapter 2. The Emperor Augustus orders a census. Now, he was a smart politician. He was great at propaganda. He has this brag sheet called the Res Gestae Divi Augusti, that is praising the divine Emperor Augustus, posted in inscriptions different places in the Roman Empire so everybody would know how generous he was with all of his wealth, some of which came from the Roman people. But anyway, he was great at propaganda. He also knew how to raise taxes discreetly. And to get the taxes right, they conducted tax censuses every 14 years or so. Now, if you want to know why people didn't like tax collectors in the Gospels, and some of the tax collectors there were probably customs agents who just drove up prices by charging fees on merchants who are traveling from place to place. But tax collectors, in the broader sense, they could search anything to make sure that they knew how much money you had, that they could tax you. They could search anything. They could pat you down, just make sure you don't have any money that you're hiding. They could pat down anything except Roman matron. Sometimes they would beat up an old lady to get them to reveal where their son fled to get away from the tax collectors. Sometimes when a village would hear the tax collectors were coming, the entire village would skip town and go start a village somewhere else because they wanted to get away from the tax collectors. So taxes could be rather extreme back then, especially in certain places. Now, these would be Herod's taxes in Judea, but in Egypt and some other places, taxes could be really high. So Augustus decrees a census. He wants to know how much property everybody has. And in Syria, this was done periodically. Everybody had to go, and Judea was part of the larger province of Syria. Everybody had to show up where they owned property. Joseph, who was originally from Bethlehem, and most Galileans were originally from Judea. They were immigrants who settled there, settlers in Galilee, sometimes a few generations back. But Joseph was originally from Bethlehem. He owed property there, and so he needed to return, even though his betrothed was ready to bear. Now, she didn't bear as soon as they got to Bethlehem. That's what you see in the movies, but she was pregnant. And they found an animal feeding trough. Now, it says there was no room in the house. Some translations say no room in the inn. That's probably a mistranslation. The Greek word means no room in the house. If there were problems, it wasn't with an innkeeper, it was more likely with the relatives. But in any case, they found an animal feeding trough in the cave out back. The reported site is preserved to this day. Here's a picture of the reported site. It's now been made into a shrine. The tradition of the site goes back to at least the early 2nd century and may well be the right site. Certainly, it's in Bethlehem, at least. And now you may be thinking that the great Emperor Augustus sets the agenda in this story, but really, this story is a contrast between the Emperor Augustus and the true King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Temple choirs around the Roman Empire hailed the mighty Augustus as Savior and God and Lord on his birthday. Augustus reigned from a palace. Jesus is born in an animal feeding trough. Earthly choirs praised Augustus. Heavenly choirs praised Jesus. Earthly choirs praised Augustus as bringer of peace, what came to be called the Pax Romana. Angels declare peace on earth. Augustus claimed to be savior and lord of the Roman Empire, but to God's own people were born this day a savior, Christ the Lord. Augustus was praised by the powerful, elite priests in the provinces. Jesus was praised among shepherds who were considered among the lowliest of professions. God is not the God of the proud. He's the God of the lowly. What does that invite us to do with our hearts before him? Now, many scholars consider Luke chapter 4, verses 16 to 30, the programmatic passage, the key passage of the Gospel of Luke. Different works have different key passages. Some don't even have passages that we might consider key passages. But in the Gospel of Luke, this is often considered the key passage. Jesus comes to the synagogue at Nazareth. Now in Mark, this happens in Mark 6. Mark doesn't give us as much detail about Jesus' rejection there, just that people didn't have a lot of faith. But he gets really rejected at Nazareth. I was recently at the traditional site of the precipice where he almost got thrown over the edge. And I don't know if it's the right side of the precipice. It is a bit of a walk from where the synagogue would have been. But in any case, Nazareth is built on a hill, and you could fall pretty far. Anyway, Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19 is often considered the key for the way Luke describes Jesus' ministry. Jesus goes on to appeal to the examples of Elijah and Elisha. He does a lot of miracles like Elijah and Elisha, but he specifically appeals to their ministry to Gentiles, like a widow in Zarephath in Phoenicia, or to Naaman, the Syrian. There's a violent response to Jesus' ministry, like you also have later in Luke Acts. Now, in Isaiah, the passage that's quoted is from Isaiah 61, where the Spirit of the Lord has anointed me. Anointed, well, you would expect that for the Messiah. Mashiach, Messiah means anointed one. The Spirit of the Lord is on me. That's a theme in Isaiah. It's also a big theme in Luke and his second volume, Acts. Preaching good news to the poor is going to see that's a major theme in Luke's gospel. Release to the captives, like when Jesus releases a woman bound by Satan in Luke chapter 13. Recovery of sight to the blind. Jesus heals the blind more than once in Luke Acts. The Gospels as a whole do emphasize the marginalized much more than most of the elite literature of their day. Luke, however, develops this theme at special length. Remember the infancy story about the shepherds who were considered lowly, and the contrast between Mary and Zechariah. We're going to look at some examples of this in terms of Jesus' ministry to the poor, Jesus' ministry to women who were marginalized in that culture in terms of positions of power, unless they were really rich. And Jesus' ministry across cultural boundaries, that'll become a major theme in the book of Acts, and Jesus' ministry to sinners. Thank God for that, or else none of us would have any hope, since all have sinned. Although some may have sinned more conspicuously than others, and that's why the people who didn't think they'd sinned very much were very upset with what Jesus was doing. Well, Jesus preaches from this text to Luke chapter 4 that talks about preaching good news to the poor. Some of his hearers may not be poor enough to like what he's saying. He says later on, when he gives his beatitudes, his blessings, blessed are the poor. He goes on to say, woe to the rich. Back then, a lot of rich people were exploiting a lot of poor people. Not everybody, and we'll see exceptions even in Luke and Acts, but that was the common pattern. And signs of the kingdom breaking in include the poor hearing the good news. Luke chapter 7, verse 22 parallel in Matthew 11:5. So he has banquets with the poor. He talks about inviting the poor and disabled to banquets. When you give a banquet, invite the poor, the disabled. Now, some people think Jesus healed everybody. Jesus sure healed a lot of people, but Jesus doesn't envision a situation in this age where completely everybody's healed. There's still going to be people that we need to minister to that haven't received healing, and we want to pray for them, pray that they'll be healed. At the same time, we also need to recognize that when God doesn't heal somebody, we still have a responsibility to help them and take care of them as best as we can. He tells a parable when the invited guests rejected the invitation. The householder invited the poor and the disabled. And Jesus says, that's what you ought to do. That's what God is doing at his banquet, the table, the messianic banquet for the kingdom. He talks about how Lazarus couldn't eat the crumbs from the rich man's table. In my country, people often blow past this and they say, well, we never let anybody starve to death at our doorstep like they did with Lazarus. But in our culture, they don't usually let anybody that poor get near our doorstep. As long as we know that people are poor, we have a responsibility to help them. Chapter 12, he condemns the rich fool who's just laying up goods for himself as if God's not going to call him to account for being a steward for what God has given him, to care for what God cares about. Then you've got the rich ruler in chapter 18, where Jesus says, give everything to the poor. And people say, that's just one guy. But in Luke 12:33, Jesus says to all of us, give what you have to the poor, lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven. Chapter 14 and verse 33, Jesus says, unless you give up all your possessions, you can't be my disciple. Luke chapter 3, John the Baptist says, if you have 2 cloaks, give one to the person who has none. Now, during this particular video, you'll only see me with 1 cloak, but I do have more than one. I do take this as hyperbole, rhetorical overstatement, but I don't want to have to do laundry every day naked. So the point, though, is that our resources don't actually belong to us. If Jesus is Lord of our life, everything we have and everything we are belongs to him. And that means that we need to do with it what he would do with it. And that means that when there are people in need, we need to try to meet those needs. I'm not going into the political ideas of how best to meet those needs. There are different understandings in terms of economics and so on. But on an individual level, I know that I need to contribute my resources to those in need and need to do my best to make sure that those needs are taken care of, politically as well. But again, there are different theories of that, and I'm outside my expertise on that. So just sticking with the text. Zacchaeus gives half of his goods to the poor. The widow gives everything. We see a model for this in the early church in Acts 2 and Acts 4. There we see them sharing possessions with those who are in need. They didn't get rid of all their possessions at the moment of their conversion. But as any had need, others would sell what they had that they didn't need and give to the poor. And that contrasts with a culture of conspicuous consumption and materialism, where we just buy things to show off or use our money that way because we don't think we have anything better to do with it. When there are people in need, get your joy by caring for those needs and serving those people. Can we learn anything from Luke Acts on this today? Now, there were people, rich people, who made it through the eye of a needle, to use Jesus' language. Joseph of Arimathea laid his own life on the line to ask for Jesus' body. You can say, well, Pilate wouldn't execute somebody, that member of the elite. Actually, governors liked to execute members of the elite so they could confiscate their possessions. So Joseph of Arimathea actually lays his life on the line to follow Jesus. Zacchaeus is another example of somebody rich who I mean, Jericho was a very wealthy place. A lot of wealthy priests lived there. So he lays down, I mean, he doesn't give up his profession, but he's going to deal with it honestly after this. And he's going to pay back double for anybody well, he's going to pay back more than that for anybody that he wronged. That was the price for a thief wronging somebody in the Old Testament. Fishermen disciples. Now, they didn't have as much, but they left all to follow Jesus. And we see that suffering levels the playing field. Jairus, as ruler of a synagogue, normally that role was an honorary role, sometimes a practical role also, but given to donors, big donors to the synagogue. Well, Jairus probably had a good bit of money. And then you have a woman with a flow of blood who has spent all her money, but they're both in desperate need. Jesus treats women with dignity. We can contrast the culture. Roman and Jewish law both limited the testimonial value of women. Some sages said all women are liars. Some said most women practice witchcraft. No, not all the sages said things like this. But comparatively speaking, women were powerless socially and economically compared to men of the same social class. Well, Luke has an emphasis on Jesus' ministry to women. You have the woman bent double for 18 long years in Luke chapter 13. In Nazareth, Jesus mentions the ministry to widows in the days of Elijah and Elisha. When he tells parables, he often balances the men and the women. So you've got a woman with 10 coins. He also includes the women mentioned by Mark. You have women exalted in Luke's gospel. Mary, blessed among women, who's compared favorably with the priest Zechariah, even though he's a good character too. You have Elizabeth, Zechariah's wife, who also responds favorably. You have the women who follow Jesus in Luke chapter 8. Now, in Mark 15, he mentions them in Mark 15, verses 40 and 41. But Luke mentions them much earlier in his gospel about these women who follow and help support Jesus' ministry. And then you have Mary contrasted with Martha. Both are women, both are doing something good. Martha's taking care of dinner. But Mary takes what Jesus says is the greater role. She's at his feet, taking the posture of a disciple. Women disciples were unheard of in Jewish tradition. You have like a century and a half later, you do have a woman who functions like a rabbi, but the male rabbis generally wouldn't listen to her. It was young men who studied with rabbis normally. Martha takes the appropriate role that her culture expected, but Mary takes a higher role. And notice that when she's at Jesus' feet, that's the posture of a disciple. That's the posture that Paul took with Gamaliel, according to Acts chapter 22 and verse 3. That's the only other place where Luke uses that same phrase of sitting at a person's feet. You have women who followed to the tomb, as in Mark, first witnesses of the resurrection, as we have also in other gospels. And Jesus crosses ethnic and cultural boundaries. You see this highlighted, for example, in his story of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. Now, before we get to the Gentile mission in the book of Acts, Jesus prepares for that. He stands up for the Samaritans when James and John want to call down fire from heaven. He says, no, that's not right. And he heals some lepers, 10 lepers in Luke chapter 17. And one of them is a Samaritan. He's the only one who comes back to give thanks. And Luke emphasizes that point. And then Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, even though a lot of Jewish people would have considered Good Samaritan an oxymoron. You're not supposed to call them good. Some details are just there to make the story a good story. I mean, Jesus is telling this story. He's not putting spiritual, mystical significance into every detail. Parables didn't work that way. They could have more than one point, contrary to what some people say, but it wasn't like you read mystical significance in every detail. Why did the man go from Jerusalem down to Jericho? Jerusalem is higher in elevation than Jericho. That's why Jerusalem is colder than Jericho. I sweated a lot in Jericho, I assure you. The story also has to have the man in trouble so the Samaritan can rescue him. And robbers were common on the Jericho road and readily targeted people traveling alone. So the guy is in trouble. He needs help. Why do the priest and the Levite pass by on the other side? Well, in Jewish tradition, one could contract ritual impurity even if one's shadow touched a corpse. The guy is half dead, apparently dead, so why risk trying to help him now? That's what they're thinking. Now, such details may advance the central message of the parable. It is found mainly in the larger story. A Samaritan rescues a Jew. The robbers might even still be around. A Jew who had probably hated him. Some people say, he wouldn't necessarily know he was a Jew. On the Jericho road, you probably would infer that. Most people traveling on that road were Jewish. This fits the context in which Jesus tells the parable. Jesus tells a law expert to love his neighbor if he wants salvation. The law expert tries to narrow the category. Well, who is my neighbor? I don't have to love everybody, do I? Jesus shows that your neighbor might be somebody you don't even like. Leviticus 19:18 says, love your neighbor as yourself. But later on in the context, it includes as your neighbor the stranger and the alien in the land. Well, that would have to include Samaritans. Most Jews hated Samaritans religiously, ethnically, and culturally, and vice versa. We can apply the principle to loving any group of people that we don't like today. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, there may be a secondary point besides reconciliation. Religious rules matter more to the priest and the Levite than human need does. Sometimes religion can blind us to God's heart for people. Now, ethnic issues in Luke are developed further in the book of Acts, Luke's second volume, relevant to mission, relevant to ethnic reconciliation and other kinds of reconciliation across boundaries. So we've seen that Jesus reaches out to different groups of people that some other people didn't think worth reaching out to, or at least treating with such dignity as Jesus did. But also, Jesus shows mercy to one group that a lot of people really thought, no, stay away from them for religious reasons. Jesus talks about hope for sinners. Tax collectors liked John. Tax collectors repented when John preached. Well, same thing when Jesus preaches. Jesus eats with tax collectors and sinners, even though in that culture, to eat with somebody established a covenant relationship of friendship with that person. And so members of more religious elite would say, you shouldn't do that. Jesus ate with them, but as he ate with them, he was calling them to repentance. And that's what it says, that many were turning to the right way. He's accused by his critics of being a friend of sinners. And one of these cases where they accuse him is in Luke 15. And that's the context where Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son. The context in Jesus' ministry usually explains or helps explain the point of the parable. Why does Jesus tell the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son in Luke chapter 15? Well, look at whom he's addressing. That helps shape our understanding of what the three stories in Luke 15 mean. Religious people are complaining that Jesus is spending time with sinners. Well, it was unbiblical to hang out with sinners. Psalm 1:1, Proverbs 13, and so forth. But it's only unbiblical to hang out with them if the influence is going from them to you. It's different if the influence is going from you to them, like a good influence from you. So Jesus tells three stories for his critics: the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. The relative value increases in each time. The first parable, it's 1 out of 100 sheep, which was basically an average sized flock. The story of the lost coin, it's 1 out of 10. And the lost son, he's got two sons. It's one out of two of those sons. It would really stretch the religious people to identify with the main character. Shepherds were considered low class, as we already mentioned, not respected, despite their role in the Old Testament. Their testimony was considered suspect. Jewish and Roman law viewed women as unstable, hence their testimonies as suspect. And religious people might despise this indulgent father who refuses to discipline his son. Does Luke agree with their perspective? Look at the opening and closing section of Luke's gospel. Shepherds are the witnesses of Jesus' birth. Women are the first witnesses of Jesus being risen. Now, sometimes people hear the story about the lost sheep and they're like, they sympathize with the 99. They're like, wouldn't the shepherd lose 99 sheep by going after the one? Not really. Remember Luke chapter 2, shepherds, plural, watching over their flocks by night. Flocks were often mingled together. Sheep knew the voices of their shepherds and they could be separated into separate flocks when necessary by calls or flute melodies. But he'd be working together with other shepherds for other flocks. He could leave his flock with them safely. And when he finds the lost sheep, brings it back on his shoulders, rejoicing, and all his friends with him rejoice. Same with the lost coin. This must have been a really poor woman if she's just got 10 coins. That would be 10 days' wages for a male worker, maybe her dowry that she inherited from her father. So, the Pharisees may be like, well, who cares about a little coin? But for this woman, that was a lot. But she's desperate to find the coin. So how can she find it? Poor Galileans often had one-room homes with a small doorway, maybe a couple small windows. She may not be able to see it well with the lighting there, so she lights a lamp to try to find the coin. These lamps were small enough you could hold them in your hand. They didn't generate a whole lot of light, but it's better than nothing. But she has to look carefully. People always dropping coins and losing them. In fact, archaeologists today date the most recent habitation of a site based on the most recent coins left in the floors. So she takes a broom, thinking if she sweeps, perhaps she'll hear it tinkle or feel it as it moves across the rough floor. Finally, she finds the coin. So she calls her friends and neighbors to celebrate with her, and they celebrate. Jesus says it's the same way with God. When what was lost to God is found, all of his friends rejoice with him. Heaven throws a big party. But while all of God's friends are rejoicing, Jesus' critics, these very religious people, are complaining. Maybe that's because these religious people aren't really God's friends. But finally, Jesus tells the story of the lost son. A certain man had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, I want my share of the inheritance now." In that culture, that was equivalent to saying, "Father, I wish you were dead." Now, that would be considered rude, even in the United States. By the way, my children are great. They never do that. But, US is not known for being particularly a culture of respect sometimes. In that culture, people would expect the father to beat the son. Now, I don't endorse beating sons. I'm just talking about the culture at this point. But instead of beating the son, instead of even making the son feel really bad, the father goes ahead and divides his inheritance. But technically what that meant was, okay, you're going to get this when I die, and you're going to get that when I die. The elder son gets 2/3, and the younger son gets 1/3. But according to law, he's just stipulating what fields and animals and so on would come to him later. The son wasn't supposed to be able to legally spend it. But this son doesn't care anything for custom or tradition. He sells his share of the father's fields and he flees to a distant country to squander his wealth. Many Jewish people did leave Judea and Galilee to look for prosperous urban life elsewhere. But all ancient moralists regarded squandering a hard-earned family inheritance as among the most evil of sins. And the Pharisees who are listening must be thinking, ah, what a rotten kid. And a stupid father, too. Actually, not just the Pharisees, probably most people listening would have thought that. The son then squanders his money on prostitutes and wild parties until finally he's broke. By the way, please don't tell my dean that I included in this pictures of semi-naked dancing frogs. But unfortunately, after he squanders all his money, that's about when a famine comes. But famines were frequent, and so he should have thought ahead. He ends up feeding pigs, and he wants to eat their food, usually carob pods, which diet, rabbis said, usually drove people to repentance. They didn't taste very good in other words. Because he dealt with pigs, he wouldn't even feel okay going to a local synagogue for help. So here you can see some pictures of carob pods. I didn't show you my own pictures because they weren't quite as ripe as the ones that I took. Well, the ones that I took were not as ripe as those. So anyway, this is about where ancient stories usually would end. And people would say, ah, of course, this is what's going to happen to you kids if you act like this kid. Ah, let it be a warning to you. But that's not where Jesus ends the story. This son comes to his senses. He says, even servants are better off in my father's house. So he decides to go home, admitting that he sinned against God, against heaven, and against his father. But his father sees him far away and runs to embrace him. In that culture, it was undignified for an older man to run. But this father doesn't care about his dignity. He throws his dignity to the wind. All he cares about is that his son, who was lost, is found, who was dead, is now alive. But the son gives his prepared speech. Father, I sinned against heaven and against you. Let me just be like one of your hired servants. Now, does the father answer him directly? No, he answers him indirectly. Bring here the best robe. Well, that would be probably the father's own robe. And a ring for his finger. That would be probably a family signet ring, symbolizing his reinstatement to sonship. And sandals for his feet. Well, servants didn't always get to wear sandals. Free people wore them a lot more. And the father is saying, I won't receive you as a servant. I'll only receive you as my son. The fatted calf, bring here the fatted calf and kill it and let us eat and be merry. The fatted calf was enough food to feed the entire village. Fathers would save such calves for special occasions, such as a son's wedding. Now, this is a parable, so you can't read too much into it, but given the way things were often done, perhaps this one was being saved for the elder son's eventual wedding. So they throw a big party again, just like in the first two stories, the lost sheep and the lost coin. When what's lost is found, they celebrate. The father announces, my son who was lost is found, who was dead is now alive. But he says the same thing later at the end of the chapter. When ancient writers wanted to bracket off a special section, they sometimes repeated an idea at its beginning and at its end. And that's where this story goes beyond the other two. Jesus goes on to tell the parable of the other lost son. Now, by the way, for the cultural background, they do a lot, of course, in ancient sources, but some of the cultural background for this goes back to Kenneth Bailey, who spent many decades in the Middle East understanding the culture there, and also the pictures that aren't from me or from Todd Boland. So just to credit where credit is due, and may as well credit PowerPoint too. Thank you, PowerPoint, and Zoom as well. But anyway, Jesus goes on to tell the parable of the other lost son. An elder son should have helped to throw the party. He should have helped to reconcile a father and a younger brother. But this elder son is so busy slaving away in the field, he's the only one in town who doesn't know about the party. Now, this is not very realistic, you think, but sometimes Jesus' parables have to burst the bounds of realism to show us our relationship to God. How absurd is the way we treat God. This elder son doesn't even know about the party. When he hears music and dancing, he asks a servant, "Hey, what's going on?" And when he learns, he refuses to enter the house. And in so doing, he insults his father's dignity, just like his brother had. By refusing to enter the house during a public celebration, he makes an intra-family dispute public news. He refuses to greet his father with a title. In that culture, the father could have beaten him. Again, not endorsing it, just saying that's what was sometimes done in circumstances like this. But instead, the father entreats this brother to come in. "This brother of yours," he says. "This son of yours," the brother responds. The elder brother is basically saying, "It's not fair that you showed him mercy. I'm good enough on my own. I don't need mercy." Listen to what he says. "I've served you all these many years." In short, the elder brother was as lost as the younger brother had been. He didn't see himself as a son, but as a servant, what the father would not allow the other brother to be. The elder brother was lost in the father's house, and the parable ends with the father pleading to the elder brother, and thus Jesus pleading to the Pharisees. Does such self-righteousness ever show up in our churches today? If so, then maybe it's a good parable to retell today as well. Now, like the other Gospels, Luke also preaches the gospel, calling us to radical commitment to the Lordship of Jesus Christ. What does it mean to follow Jesus? Well, we have a couple stories in Matthew chapter 8. Luke includes those two and also a third one. And so I'm going to cover this here in Luke. Someone promises Jesus, "I'll follow you anywhere you go." Jesus tests him. "Birds and foxes have homes, but I have nowhere to rest. If you want to follow me, count the cost. I don't guarantee you anything in this world. I'm not promising you great prosperity if you follow me. I'm promising you, you get what matters most. You get me." Someone else says, "Let me just go and bury my father first." Jesus says, "Let the dead bury their dead. You go preach the kingdom of God." Now, does that sound harsh to anyone? But how dead was his father anyway? When someone died, mourners would immediately gather. You have that in the case of Jairus' daughter. At least 2 mourners were required, even for the poorest person. This helped people get their grief out, express their grief. If he knows his father is dead, why is he away from the house to begin with? So the father may not be dead yet. Right away, the corpse would be laid on a stretcher and carried to the tomb. Everyone who saw the procession would join it from behind. Rabbis would even let out their classes for funeral processions or wedding processions. They were supposed to join in the procession as part of the community. The widow or the mother would walk in front of the bier, the stretcher on which the body lay. Notice that in Luke 7, Jesus met the widow of Nain before touching the bier. That's because he wasn't coming from behind. He was coming from the front. He wasn't planning just to join the funeral procession and mourn with the widow. He was coming to raise the son. But this son is not at a funeral procession. He should be helping to lead all that. He can't be out talking with a rabbi missing the funeral procession. And then at the end of the funeral procession, the eldest son would be the one to deposit the body in the antechamber of the family tomb or in the dirt, depending on whether they were wealthy or poor. If the deceased had no son, the nearest of kin would do it. John's disciples did it for him. Jesus' disciples were, well, they don't turn out looking too good in comparison with John's disciples on this point. Then the family would sit and mourn for 7 days. while others came to comfort them and bring them food, which is why in John chapter 11, Mary and Martha met with Jesus separately. They had guests at their home. In this period, the body would then be left to decompose for a year. Some teachers may have thought that this helped atone for sins. But after, and we have some references to that in some of the rabbis, but after 1 year, the son would return to gather up the bones into a box called an ossuary, and then slide the box into a slot on the wall. This was called secondary burial, or it is called secondary burial. If his father's already dead, this might be the kind of burial the son may be talking about, hence requesting as much as a year's delay. There's also another possibility here, and that may be it's a figure of speech that appears in some Semitic languages, that the son is saying, wait till my father dies and I fulfill my final filial obligation. So it may not be right there on the spot that he has to leave, but he is saying, I have to fulfill this obligation to my family. So I can't follow you all the time for years to come. So even if Jesus isn't saying, hey, drop the funeral, come follow me right now, that doesn't mean that his demand is light. Whether we're talking about the first burial or the second burial or promise of burial, this was a son's greatest responsibility in that culture. Many sages considered honoring parents the greatest commandment and burying them the greatest expression of that commandment. To fail to bury one's father was so shameful, one would be an outcast for life in one's village. The only one who could rightly take such precedence over parents was God, as in Deuteronomy 13. And Jesus here stands in that role. So this is about the priority of following Jesus, not about the urgency of following him. But the next story goes on to talk about the urgency of following him. Someone else just asks to say goodbye to his parents. And Jesus says, no one who starts plowing and then looks back is fit for God's kingdom. Does that sound harsh? Where in the Old Testament do we read about a calling in the context of somebody plowing? Jesus alludes to the story of Elijah calling Elisha. Elijah was a radical prophet who lived in the wilderness and ate food from birds' mouths, or maybe from their talons, I don't know. Many prophets had radical calls. Ezekiel wasn't allowed to mourn when his wife died. Jeremiah was never allowed to marry. Hosea probably wished he had never been allowed to marry. Isaiah ran around naked and barefoot for 3 years, and maybe his wife wished she hadn't married him. But then again, she was a prophetess, so maybe she's used to these kind of things. Elijah ate food brought to him by birds. John ate insects, although locusts were kosher, we were allowed to eat locusts. Ezekiel ate food cooked over dung. Elisha, to become a prophet, he was giving up a lot to follow Elijah. And look, Elisha actually was fairly wealthy. He had 12 yoke of oxen, which means, he didn't need all of those just to work for himself. He only needed 1 yoke of oxen for that. So he had many fields and many servants or many workers. He was ready to give it all up, burning the oxen as a sacrifice and a meal. He just wanted to say goodbye to his family, by which he meant throw a little farewell party for himself. Elijah allows it. But Jesus says, no. The call to be a disciple of Jesus is more radical than the call to be an Old Testament prophet. Is that the message we preach today? Do we help people to understand that Jesus is worth everything? And no matter what we might have to give up to follow him, Jesus is worth all of it. Luke also has other emphases. Major ones include prayer, empowerment by the Holy Spirit to speak prophetically for God. These kind of emphases, like the emphasis on ethnic reconciliation, become central in volume 2 of Luke's work, the book of Acts.